journal, the main journal, the IEEE Transactions on Effective Computing, and I'm really looking forward to this lecture today, so enjoy and ask as many questions as you can.
Please. Can we turn this light off?
Yes. This is always an adventure, but I'll try. So dim front, and everything goes off. Then I have to pull.
I like that. That's right.
Okay, fine.
So it's the weird thing that you have to.
Right.
Wait.
It was fine. Just with this one.
Nope.
Oh, you're saying when you turn this off, then
Yeah.
2 seconds later everything goes off?
Just barely tap it.
It's dim. Dim front.
Yeah, right.
And then everything
Oh.
goes off. And then I have to, and then I have to press.
No, right there, right there.
There you go.
Right.
It's
Weird.
Who saw this?
Oh.
How did you feel?
Uncomfortable.
Uncomfortable? Why did you feel uncomfortable?
Well, they were just going at it. Like it wasn't a debate that I'd been familiar watching in the past. It was just a very different style. I don't know. They weren't really focusing on any important issues, and they're just going at it. I don't know.
Anyone else?
Mm.
Did it make you feel an emotion?
I guess yes, I did, because the way they were, it seemed like everything was related to some kind of sexual connotation or something in regards to, they had different views, but it was just more of their personal lives about what was happening.
What do you think is going on in this image?
He's not happy with Hillary.
This image is, this posture was tweeted a bunch about last night. So why people would fixate on this particular image?
I don't know, because you try to look at Scherer with his little eyes and really disrespectful,
Yeah.
I guess.
Some people argued, well, apparently throughout the debate he stood behind her.
Yeah.
And there was some feeling that that was an attempt to look intimidating or try to intimidate. He's much taller, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of times in these debates, so why do you think they show these side-by-side shots?
Probably for whoever's talking, if they're referring to the other opponent, then the audience can see how they react to the.
Why is that important?
Because then you can kind of judge based on how they react, probably before they're even aware of how they're reacting to it, whether they're truthful, lying, if they're nervous, if they're confident.
So you're helping, if you think it helps you read their mind?
It kind of lets you understand a better idea of how they feel about the situation rather than just taking one person's word for it.
What is she doing? What's this facial expression? Smiling. Do you think she feels joy at this moment?
Yeah.
Yes. She might have actually. Hard to say. I think there are certain times when she was using that expression, it was clearly not joy. But yeah, there's some times where she's happy. So, do you think these reaction shots affect how you would vote? No. Anyone think that? Do you think other people would be affected by? Do you think whether a person shows emotion in a situation like this should impact your decision about whether they are worthy to be president? What about in a criminal trial? A lot of times they focus on the facial expressions. When you read a story, it always talks about the, like when the decision is read out, the story will always have some sentence about how the defendant reacted. think it will reveal their true mental state, or if they're an honest person? Yeah, well, regardless of whether it's true or not, yeah. So juries look at this. I don't know, this is an older case. It was in California. They interviewed the jury afterwards, and they said that they voted to convict him because he didn't show any emotion during the trial. Okay? So they viewed the lack of emotion as a signal of dishonesty. In fact, that comes up in a lot of different circumstances. We feel like if you don't show emotion, you must be hiding something. So you must be evil. So think about being more expressive in your daily life. I'm going to talk today, just in general, about how emotion might be useful for machines, and how machines could understand and try to manipulate human emotion. And this is stuff I've done with a lot of people, including Stefan and other people from our lab, graduate students. Now, I think everyone has read in the press, and there's a 60 Minutes piece actually after the debate that talked about emotions that machines evoke in people. So AI right now, a lot of people are worried of AI taking over. I think you were saying there was a question about, is AI going to be benevolent or malevolent? What do you think? I assume you guys want to make good AI, right? What if your company wants you to make evil AI? Okay. Actually, I'm on an IEEE ethics committee right now. We're trying to decide what ethical guidelines should be put on machines, because there's a perception that, at least, that emotion is something very private and potentially very easy to manipulate. And imagine a machine that really understood what you're feeling moment to moment and had the ability to change that, maybe to make you buy a car, or maybe to make you vote for a candidate. Is that okay? It's currently considered okay for people to do that, right? So that's some of the questions IEEE is. In general, there's a lot of interest because of the concern AI is raising about what ethical limits should be placed on the development of this technology, and emotion is a big part of that. So machines are generating emotions in people, but what's sort of less obvious to the general community is that we're trying to, in some sense, make machines understand emotion. So these are some examples of why you might want to do that. This is Sidney DeMello. He's a researcher at Notre Dame. And if you study how teachers or tutors interact with students, they actually use emotion all the time. So they're looking, I mean, a lot of it's really emotion management. They're trying to control, if you think of elementary school, how do you control the emotion of those kids to keep them from like hitting each other or not paying attention, getting bored. But so a lot of that actually is, can you make a machine tell that the student is bored, so I have to make the exercise more interesting, or if they're about to hit the machine, so I better like make the lesson material simpler, or tell them, hey, you can do it, it's okay. In LA, there's a lot of interest in controlling emotions on the freeway. So there's actually a company, it seems a little hokey to me, but they have a device that tries to sense if you're angry, and it's tied to a seat, and the seat tries to give you a little massage. This is some work I'll talk about a little bit later, but in general, there's a lot of interest in, could we use machines to teach people to use emotion better? So many of us kind of assume that when you express an emotion, that's the emotion that person feels. But in a lot of contexts, people show a different emotion. And in fact, in certain commercial contexts, they actually teach people to show different emotions. So if you've worked in retail, you have to give a persona. And you tell someone, Brad, that's a really nifty looking sweater. You look really good. Maybe you'd look even better if you bought this one. So people are taught to portray a certain emotion to make the customer experience better. And they even will like put pencils in your mouth to teach you how to smile and strange things like that. So, could we use technology, or maybe it's a person person with a deficit, like someone who's autistic, who doesn't necessarily know how to understand emotional signals as well, could we use technology to help people be better with human emotion? A little bit weird, but there's a lot of interest in that. Of course, entertainment is all about emotion, right? And so there's a lot of interest in using emotional techniques, recognizing emotion, or how to manipulate emotion in the context of games or fun robots. And as I kind of alluded to before, I mean, manipulating emotion is an important aspect of commerce. And so there's companies that do market research where they'll try to look at how you're moment-to-moment reacting, say, to a commercial or to a movie, to try to understand how to make that commercial or movie more effective. Back in the old days, if you're a Hollywood person, there was a time it was very popular to bring in the audience and everyone had a little dial. And then you try to give these metrics back to the director and say, hey, your movie sucks, you have to fix it here. And so this is actually accompanied by Roz Picard at MIT, where they crowdsource, they send out over the web, say, a commercial or a debate video, and they'll use cameras in all of the Turkers, homes to look at their facial expressions and come up with a summary and try to say, okay, maybe we should cut this scene right here because everyone's falling asleep. And then this is, in terms of trying to manipulate people, this is actually a machine that will look at your facial expression. If you smile strongly, it'll give you a free candy bar. And so it's kind of using your emotions to get you engaged with the product. And also, if you feel happy after getting this candy bar because you just smiled, you'll have a stronger association with that product. You shown this stuff?
A little bit.
So this is a project Stefan and I worked on. I want to illustrate it because it emphasizes a number of aspects of using emotion in technology. So this is a project, Ellie, or some sensei, is intended to get people to talk about their emotions and mental health. So the idea is that many people are reluctant to seek care, and maybe we could use technology to help get people to seek care and also talk more honestly about what they feel, so we can tell if they need treatment or not. So what was interesting about this project was that so a lot of people fear talking to a therapist. And the original funders of this project was DARPA, that's a defense agency. One of the things that soldiers fear admitting they're weak. Actually came up recently in some of the comments. There was a bunch of discussion about Trump saying that soldiers are weak, they get PTSD, and that there was a lot of debate about whether that was the right thing to say or not. But there is good evidence that people who feel a stigma, a soldier stigma might be weak, it might be that you broke women, I don't know, and you don't want to admit those things, so you fear being judged by other people. And what's interesting is that there's a fair amount of research that suggests that people feel less fear when they interact with a computer than another person. And that's why, in fact, a lot of diagnostic instruments for mental health, you'll fill out a questionnaire on a computer before you talk to a person, because people are more honest talking to a computer, in a sense. On the other hand, what people are good at if you're an expert interviewer is you can build rapport, draw people out, ask them questions and follow-up questions. And so another way to get people to be more honest is to build rapport. And so what's interesting about this project was that on the one hand we could have this body, this character that could try to create empathy, build rapport, but on the other hand she could emphasize she's a computer program. And so in fact we have some evidence that the rapport helps get people to talk, and the fact that she's a computer evokes less fear in the people interacting with her. But let me just play a little clip here. This is Ellie.
Thanks for joining today. I was created to talk to people in a safe and secure environment. I'm not a therapist, but I'm here to learn about people and would like to learn about you. I'll ask a few questions to get it started. And please feel free to tell me anything. Your answers
obviously his answers weren't totally confidential. Several things going on here. One is, you can't really see it, but I'm sure Stefan talked about this a little bit. You'll see these little lines on the person's face. Those who've watched the 60-minute piece, Maya Pontic is a researcher at Imperial, does the same kind of stuff. You can see these little dots on people's faces. This is trying to track this person's emotional expressions moment to moment. So that's an aspect of affective computing. Can't see it here, but this is Stefan's expertise is looking at the audio signal and trying to extract features relevant to emotion from the speech. We have a Connect on this person, and so you can look at their nonverbal bodily postures. One thing is, if you do this to yourself, it's called the self-adapter. This is actually an indicator of stress. Okay? So if you're giving a job interview, don't do that. We're looking at, for automatically recognizing the words, and then we're trying to infer some affect from the speech. It's called sentiment analysis. And then I get this character, and this, I don't know if you noticed it, the character is showing facial expression. So she's trying to convey some kind of emotional attitude to what the person is saying. She's using posture and gestures. And then what the character is also doing is, because we're able to recognize these signals in real time, you're actually able to respond to them in real time. So normally when, like, if I say something, you guys will like nod or look at me, do these kind of momentary behaviors. That makes me know that you're paying attention, right? And so we're able to get this character to give this kind of low-level contingent feedback that makes people feel like they're being listened to. So all that kind of stuff is relevant to this field of affective computing. It's trying to sense these signals, generate these signals, and try to understand what they tell us about underlying mental state. So I'm going to talk about three aspects. Well, first I'll kind of say a little bit of motivation why affective computing is something interesting to do, and then I'll talk about three different aspects of it. One is how emotions influence the way we think and make decisions, and how computers can help us understand that. In fact, how, at some level, having that model might make it better to recognize what the meaning of these signals are. I'll talk about how people respond to a robot or a virtual character that produces emotional signals. And then I'll talk about how you can then use that to make people buy a more expensive car or be more healthy in their life choices. So a couple of recurring themes. One is that most AI kind of has this view of what thinking is, rational, logical, but people are more like this often. Most of our decisions are based, whether we like it or not, on how we feel in the moment. That has certain consequences. And AI, and maybe society in general, would benefit from an awareness of how emotion communicates that person's mental state and motivation and shapes the way they think. Another theme, so I mean, emotion is a human phenomenon. And most of you who are in computer science, maybe if you're like me, you went into computer science because you don't like to deal with people. You want to deal with something that's like more understandable, rule-based. And so a lot of us are not actually trained in thinking about humans. And what I would argue, and there's a growing interest, in, not just in emotion, but in making AI human aware. And to understand how to make machines aware of people, we have to learn something about people. You can try to reinvent psychology all by yourself, but I would argue that's not the best approach to take. So that what I'll talk about really is, I think, to make this field of affective computing work, you really have to bite the bullet and learn something about psychology, but more importantly, find people in the field that you can collaborate with, and really you're learning enough about psychology so you can have the same language, so you can talk to each other. So I'm not saying you should become psychologists, but you should learn how to talk to them. And so in my work, we tend to take psychological theory and try to somehow instantiate that into some computational system. And then we have people interact with that computer system. And what that, on one hand, tells us is, for example, we're trying to model emotion. Does it use emotion the way people use emotion? And so we can use those humans interacting with the system to improve the artifact, but sometimes the artifact can then tell us something about the person and then inform psychological theory as well. So there's really a two-way street that psychologists and computer scientists working together can both improve technology and our understanding about people. Why should we build affective computing? Well, first of all, what does affect mean? Who knows what the word affect means? What's that?
The impact of something.
To affect something.
Yeah.
Impact. Yeah, that's actually kind of one word. That's actually not what it's meant in this context. And this is what, if you look at affect in Webster's, it says it's the subjective aspect of an emotion that's apart from the bodily change. So what does that mean? It means my awareness that I'm having an emotion. So this is actually the more common. Well, this thing has an effect. If I always get effect and affect
It affects
mixed.
something.
Something affects something. So that's not what we mean in affective computing. This is also not what we mean in affective computing. So in affective computing, really the term affect, it means emotion plus plus. So when you say affective computing, it's not just emotion computing, it's, so thinking about emotions is thinking about other things that are related to emotions. So like moods, which actually moods are much easier for a machine to recognize than an emotion, because emotion is very rapid, moment-to-moment phenomena, where mood, you can be in a crappy mood all day long, so we have a lot more data on you. Tell your mood, interpersonal stances, are you cold or warm today? Preferences, your personality, culture, these are all things that fall within the field of affective computing and trying to make machines reason about these kind of more emotion-like things. Now, one question that always confronts us is, well, why would we want to make machines? Why would you want to make your computer emotional? Isn't it like too complicated already? And so the field kind of struggles with, well, what is the benefit of giving computers emotional intelligence? I alluded to it a little bit before, but some people actually want to give emotions to a machine and make the machine in some sense emotional. Is that a good thing? And this is kind of a very old debate. So going back to at least recorded history, and if you're curious, there's a number of Chinese, I think, Asian people in the class. I don't know as much about the philosophical role of emotion in Asian thought, but in Western thought, there's a very old tradition of saying that a human is made up of really two things, intellect and emotion, and they're at war with each other. Okay? Sometimes one wins and sometimes another wins. And so Plato argued that you can think of a person as being controlled by these two horses. They're really there's the intellect and the emotion, and you're try to fight to see which one's in charge. And he thought that emotion was bad. He thought we actually shouldn't watch theater because that would evoke emotion in people and make us do bad things. Romans, similar thoughts. So Cicero is a famous emotion theorist. He argued that emotions make us stupid, so we need to learn to control them. Okay. Moving forward, Hume, actually he's considered by many to be the founder of decision theory, so how we make decisions. And Hume also had this idea that there were these two processes, but he thought, in fact, emotion was absolutely essential. And so he, in his thinking, if you think of decision theory, you have this utility function, okay? Utility, and you're trying to maximize utility. And so he equated utility with emotion. So really, what we're trying to do with decision theory is maximize pleasure. And without pleasure, there's no point in doing anything. So we need to have emotion. Otherwise, decision theory has no utility. It's nothing to decide. Darwin looked at emotion and argued help us solve problems in the world. And so he then, he had a famous book about emotion where he tried to go in and say, well, what is the function of emotion and facial expression? Why do we have facial expressions of emotion? There's some that argue that, you talked in the beginning that, this criminal, you think you can read their mind, right, through their facial expressions. So why would that evolve? Why would a criminal have a mechanism that would let you tell he's a criminal by the emotions he shows on his face? Shouldn't you be able to control that so you don't have to reveal you're a bad person? So what Darwin tried to argue is that these expressions are there because they have a function. So when we're surprised, we open our eyes, okay? And that actually allows more light in. It makes us see better. If we also open our mouth and pull in air, why is that? Because we might have to do something in a second, like run away or attack. And so Darwin tried to look at these facial expressions and point out that they're there not necessarily, or at least originally not there because they communicate something, but because we need to do that expression to do whatever action is going to happen when you're in that moment. He also tried to point out that, well, maybe some of these things don't make sense anymore. So in the old days, if you're mad at somebody, you want to bite them, so you need to bare your teeth. But maybe nowadays we don't do that so much. But it's still there because we had thousands of years of evolution, millions of years of evolution pointing us in that direction. He also pointed out, though, that some of these things may have had an original function, but as we became social animals, they had a communicative function, and that may be beneficial as well. And in fact, some of the expressions may be there exactly to help with that communication. So the idea being that you don't want, if you bare your teeth when you're angry, you don't want to confuse someone that you're angry when you're not. So when you're in a different state than anger, you exaggerate things that help you disambiguate the signal. Now, when AI people got to this, and so in the 1950s, when AI was beginning, they were trying to think of human cognition as information processing, and there was a lot of discussion of what emotion would be in this context. In fact, many of the early emotion theorists, AI theorists, argued that you absolutely had to have emotion in a machine. Herb Simon said that he's a famous Nobel-winning economist, one of the founders of AI, argued that a machine shouldn't be able to think unless it had something like emotion in it. Now, interestingly, as AI developed, emotion was viewed to be too complicated in a sense, and so a lot of people focused on logic and decision theory and left out emotion. In fact, all bodily processes. So really, they focus on the brain. So this is an image of a cognitive architecture that tried to model human mind. If you notice, it's got everything but the body in here. And so a lot of AI people thought emotion and bodily processes like physiology, we don't need to think about that. All we have to think about is the symbol processing up here. That's not beginning to change. Skip that. So, and actually, one of the important people in making a change is here at USC now. Who knows who this guy is? This is Antonio Damasio. He was at Iowa. He's a famous theorist and experimentalist in emotion. He's a medical doctor, actually. So he made his name looking at patients that had lesions in their brains that led them to seem not to have emotions. And so one of his famous patients, he was scored very high on IQ tests. He would self-report no feeling of emotion, and although in the moment when you talk with him he seemed fine, he was horrible at making decisions in his life, and he was institutionalized. And through Antonio's work, they had fairly compelling evidence that emotion, just like Hume said, If we don't have emotion, we can't make decisions. So patients that had damage in a certain part of the brain, they had difficulty making decisions. They're good at laying out. You ask them, where should we go for lunch? Okay, well, we can go this place, we can go this place, we go this place, this. They keep thinking out things about the decision, but they couldn't actually make the decision because they had the argument being lost, the sense of feeling the guide which decision they should make. So like what Hume said, emotion tells us what is good, it's the utility, it tells us how to make decisions. People without emotion are unable to make decisions, the argument. And actually a lot of computer scientists, myself included, read this book of his, and that kind of within affective computing was one of the big pushers of people to be interested in the term how emotion relates to computing. Now the term itself comes from Roz Picard. She's a signal processing person at MIT, and she became very interested in using technology to measure affective signals in people. Galvanic skin response, she focuses more on the physiology of that. She's doing a lot of stuff with face these days. And so she coined the term, produced a book that a lot of us read, and now affective computing is really kind of taking off. So there's a journal, there's a regular conference, there's a society, and there's actually many people here at USC are focused on this topic. Okay, so at ICT, where I work with Stefan, the original motivation for ICT was to build virtual people. Actually, it was founded by a guy from Hollywood who was in charge of the Star Trek movie, which is why you're seeing a lot of the Star Trek stuff on the slides. And so his model for what ICT was to build something called the holodeck. Who knows what the holodeck is? You're all too young. This is a video of the holodeck. So holodeck is a place on a spaceship where you could go and talk to imaginary people. You would see these 3D creations of people, and they could be like Einstein or famous physicists, and then you could talk to them in this virtual room. And so really it's the idea of creating virtual characters that can be in a space with you that you can have a conversation with, and you can learn, in this case, this character Data would learn things about physics or whatever, but you could play games, you could do all sorts of interesting things. This is a little more modern version. This is kind of a version of the holodeck that one of my colleagues, David Traum, created. It's in conjunction with the Scherer Foundation, which is here on campus. And the idea is that the way we often learn things is through stories told by people who experienced them. And one of the stories that the Scherer Foundation is interested in is the Holocaust. And they have Holocaust survivors go to schools and emotionally tell the stories about what happened to them. And the idea of being through that emotional telling to get people to empathize, understand, and change behavior. Problem with that is the Holocaust survivors are dying, right? Similar issues with World War II vets. So at some point, these people's stories just become videos that you have to watch. And the idea is, could you do something like the holodeck with a Holocaust survivor? And that led to this project.
This is a lullaby that my mother used to sing to me, and I still remember it. It's in Polish. Jadą dzieci, jadą drogą, siostrzyska i brat, nienawidzić się nie mogą, jaki piękny świat.
So what they've been able to create is a 3D representation of this person, and they've interviewed him on all his stories, and then they've built AI so you can ask that character all kinds of questions, any question really, and it'll try to answer. And you can go to the Chicago Holocaust Museum and talk to this character right now. Okay? Now, my interest was, if you're building something like that, is trying to tell something emotional, and people can ask it anything. They could say, well, you know the Holocaust didn't really happen, right? And that character has to be able to have a response to that. And so my kind of question was, well, how would a character know what to feel? What emotion should it portray given the context that just occurred. So a lot of, well, the first thing I want to talk about is how would an AI know how to reason about what emotion is appropriate in a given situation? Okay. So it's more on the cognitive aspects. And so I mentioned that we really need to think about theory. And so one of the primary theories that describes what emotion a person ought to feel in a certain circumstance is called appraisal theory. And appraisal theory says that, you know, emotion is not just something in the world, it's not something in our head, it's a relationship between things in the world and things in our head. So let me give you an example. Let's imagine I have a goal in life, I want to be a mad scientist. And I'm going to school, or maybe you want to be someone that can do multimodal machine learning in Stefan's class, and you fail your test, your midterm. You have a midterm yet? You got to have one? Oh. Okay. So you have this event, you have this goal, and so what appraisal theory argues is that when things happen that are relevant to your goals, you make various inferences. Is this good or bad? Did I expect to fail? How much control do I have over doing better in the future? Who do I blame? Do I blame Stefan or myself because I didn't prepare? And based on that pattern of judgments, it will tend to elicit a certain emotion. So if it was unexpected and I thought I should do well, I'll feel sad. Further, appraisal theory would argue that there's different ways to respond to that event. So if I feel some control over the situation, then I will basically confront or approach the situation. I will engage in what's called problem-focused coping, and I'll try to change the world to regulate this emotion. So if I fail my test and I feel some control, I'll say, okay, I know I can do better next time. I'll hire a tutor, or I'll study harder, or I won't party so much. Alternatively, if you feel you have no control over the situation, you'll engage in what's sometimes called emotion-focused coping. You'll give up your goal, essentially, or change your goal in a way that will lead you to have a different emotional state. So maybe I'll give up being a mad scientist and I'll join a band. So these are different ways. So appraisal leads to emotional responses, and then based on appraisal as well, that influences how we regulate or deal with the emotional response. And so it's really a kind of a cycle that unfolds over time. And what's interesting from an AI perspective is a lot of these judgments are things that we're taught about as AI scientists. So there are things like utility, probability, how much control of it. It's like, do I have a plan to change the future? And credit assignment. So these are things that we have algorithms for. And so some work in modeling these processes basically tries to take that theory, appraisal theory, and then map it into AI reasoning. And so if we think of, this is some representation of goals and beliefs and desires and actions. Maybe we have this goal with some utility that I want to be a mad scientist. And this act just occurred that confronts that goal, that defeats it. Then what AI techniques allow us to do is, if you put it into some kind of planning representational framework, you can reason about how actions affect goals, and then you can have simple rules that say, well, if I had a goal with some value and it was confronted with some probability, I should feel a certain amount of negative affect. And if I had some prior beliefs about whether it was happened or not, I can calculate whether that was expected or not, and so forth. And then these simple rules can lead to appraisals that would say, okay, this thing happened, it was bad, I feel a negative affect. But then as I reason about the situation and think, oh, here's an action I can do to make it better, that will lead the character automatically to have a different emotional state. And some of my work was then taking those models and saying, hey, now we can throw that model into the head of this character, and then you can have it tie those appraisals to facial expressions or what have you, and you can actually now begin to see into the mind of the character. You can see its emotions. So this is a really kind of hokey, but these are two surfer dudes. I gave them a domain theory. One wants to make a lot of money by winning the lottery, one wants to go surfing, and they can reason about their goals. So this guy wants to go surfing, but he doesn't know whether there's any waves, so he's sad, and the other guy tells him, hey, there's some waves, so he's happy, and so forth, and you can see that through their behavior.
I want to make some big money. I want to catch some waves. Hey Steve, what's wrong? I really want to catch some waves, but I can't find some good breakers. Steve, does it help that someone did say there's some great waves near the pier?
So anyway, kind of hokey, but you can see these characters are expressing what they feel. Other characters can see what they feel and use that as prompts to ask questions, and as information is exchanged and they reason about it, their emotional state changes and gets reflected. And so that basic idea, although kind of crude, has been used in a number of the applications that we subsequently developed at ICT. And so we have these simulations where you can interact with characters for, say, leadership training or negotiation or just to have fun. And those characters' nonverbal behavior can be driven by models of how they should feel moment to moment. So we can't necessarily plan out in advance everything that person can do. We have to reason about it and then have the character respond appropriately in the moment. Now, just to turn to psychology again, some of what we do with these models then is we try to see, well, does this model actually capture what a person does? And so how do we know that's a good model? And so a lot of my research has been basically trying to take that model and use it to make predictions about how people respond in some situation and see if people really respond in that way. And so a lot of what we do is we build really simple games to try to evoke emotion in people and see can we predict their emotional responses, and does the model capture not just what they feel but how intensely they feel, and also do they show what they feel on their face and so forth. So this really simple game is called Mouse Wars. The idea is that you have a mouse up here, and then each person takes turns clicking really fast on the computer mouse to try to grow this lottery wheel. Okay, so you can see he's clicking on the mouse, the wheel gets bigger, this thing spins. If it lands on this color, the mouse moves towards his goal. If it gets to his goal, he wins some money. Okay. And then the next guy does the same thing. And so, and they can see each other too. It turns out these are a couple of my students. So he loses. And really simple game, but what's nice about the game is that you can think of it as a very simple state space where initially you start here and the player is trying to get to one of these, to a goal, right? And you can look at how you can manipulate their emotions by, say, manipulating the factors that should be predicted by appraisal theory to influence their emotional states. We can, give them more or less money if they win or lose. We can play with how the situation unfolds over time. So, are they about to win and then they lose? And in fact, what you learn from psychology is that a great way to do these things is you trick people. So they think they're playing this game, but in fact, I'm controlling the game. So it unfolds exactly how I want, and nobody notices. So you can make players look like they're about to win, oh, and they lose. Or look like they're going to lose and they win. We can play with other factors, and then we can see how do those factors influence their emotional state. Like are they playing with a friend or a stranger, and so forth. And so, just one example of that, we ran a study where we manipulated their perceived chance of winning and whether they're playing with a friend or a stranger. And how does that influence their emotional state? And we looked at, basically we stopped the game at certain points and we asked people how they felt. So, are you happy, are you sad? How much control do you have? We looked at when they're ahead, when they're behind, when they pulled even, when they won or lost. And And then we also looked at what they're showing on their face. Okay, so you got this wheel that spins. What do you show on your face when it lands on a positive or negative state? Now the model would predict that as you get closer to winning, you should feel more joy. If you get closer to losing, you should feel less joy. When you pull to even, you should be back to even in a sense. And really, how much you feel should be influenced by how important it is for you to win. So if it's really, if you win a lot of money, you should feel more joy. If you don't win any money in this game, or you don't care about this game, you shouldn't care whether you're winning or losing, right? So those are predictions from the model. So basically, how much joy you feel is influenced by your probability of winning, and how much importance you assign to winning. Those are two predictions. And the actual data, and also the model didn't have any predictions about whether you're playing with a friend or stranger. So the model currently argues that it's just whether you win or lose. So what we saw was that kind of, basically the model was correct, although people, for whatever reason, always thought they were going to win this game. And there's other stuff in psychology that explains that. But the probability of goal attainment influenced their self-reported joy, and how much they wanted to win the game influenced their self-reported joy is predicted by the model. Whether they're playing with a friend or stranger didn't influence how much joy they said they felt. It was all tied to how likely was their win. But when you looked at their facial expressions, interestingly, facial expressions predicted whether they're winning or losing. So you could look at the facial expression of that person and infer whether they're winning or losing the game, but only if they were friends playing each other. When you had strangers playing each other, their facial expressions didn't tell you anything about how well they were doing in the game. And so that gets to one important point I want to get across in this lecture, is that facial expressions aren't an automatic window into people's soul. But there's many factors that influence what facial expressions people show on their face. And one is, for example, strangers. Well, our argument here is that strangers feel uncomfortable showing what they feel, and so they suppress the emotions that they show. And that makes it harder then to elicit information about what's going on in their head, or index it through facial expressions. Let's see where we are. So we're supposed to go 2 hours. Now, let's see, I think I'll skip this part. Okay, so now we get this model, we can put it in a character, and we can make that character show emotional expressions. Okay, whether the character is a robot or a virtual person. So it doesn't matter. So if a robot smiled at you, would that change how you felt? It's a robot, why would you care? So part of the question was, do people react to the expression shown by these characters? And so the idea here being that now we get this thing called appraisal theory. And appraisal theory says, okay, I got an event, I got a goal, and that leads to an emotional expression. And so let's say I'm walking down the street and I see a robot coming up to me, and that robot steps on my foot. Okay. And that robot smiles. What do you think that tells you? The robot found joy in stepping on my foot. And then how would you react to that robot? Insensitive robot. It showed an emotion. It's sensitive. Yeah, so the argument is that we see these facial expressions, and we kind of run a simulation of appraisal theory in our head when we see an emotional expression. So we see this robot, it stepped as an event, it steps on our foot and it shows an attitude towards that event. What we do when we observe that is we try to say, well, what goal was that robot must have had to lead it to have that particular emotion in that moment? Okay, so what I argue theoretically is that what people do when they see facial expressions in others is they're using it to infer goals. Okay, and so in this case, we probably infer this is an evil robot, because why would it want to step on my foot if I'm enjoying that? So this is a different example. Who knows what prisoner's dilemma is? Okay, just a few people. Prisoner's dilemma is a game invented to study how people make social decisions. And basically, well, the motivation was, imagine you're a prisoner and you and your Renz and I just robbed the liquor store, and we got busted, but they just suspect us, they have no evidence, right? And so if you see CSI, they're going to put us in different rooms, right? And they'll say, hey, your friend, Renz, just ratted out on you. He told us that you robbed the liquor store, not him. And so the idea is that you have a dilemma. So if I trust Renz is going to keep quiet, I shouldn't say anything, and if we both are quiet, we'll get off. But if one of us rats out the other one, they get off, but I go to jail. And if we both rat each other out, we both go to jail. So it creates this dilemma of, do I trust the other person? And so mathematically, you have people play these games where you give them a payoff matrix. We say, hey, you can win some money based on your decisions. And so you usually don't say it's like a prisoner dilemma. You want to make it just about the money. So you say, hey, you got a couple options. You can choose green or blue. They can choose green or blue. If you both choose green, you make $5. If you both choose blue, you make 4. But hey, if you choose green and they choose blue, you make a bunch and they make a little. So it creates this tension between, on the one hand, there's an incentive to cooperate and make the most money by cooperating together, but you could be exploited, or you have the temptation to exploit the other person. And if you're a game theorist or an AI person or decision theorist, and you calculate the best thing to do, you should choose this choice. This is called the dominant strategy because, well, I'm not going to go into it, but basically, AI algorithms would predict you should both defect on each other. But in fact, most people are much more cooperative than would be predicted by these game theoretic models, and it's been argued that emotion is part of why people are able to solve this dilemma. And so, imagine you're playing this game with this robot, and this robot smiles. Is that going to make you more or less willing to cooperate with this robot? Huh? Less? More? You know, creepy smile. Well, the argument is it depends. If we just cooperated together and the robot smiles, then I do this kind of mind reading and I think, oh, well, maybe it's a good robot. On the other hand, if it just screwed me over in this game, if I cooperated and exploited me, and it smiles, then the exact same smile, slightly different context, would tell me something different about its goals. Okay? So again, this is about mind reading. So when we see an emotional expression, we're looking at this expression is telling us what is that person's attitude towards that event. And the exact same smile has very different meaning depending on the nature of that event. That's what I'm trying to argue here. So what we did to show this is we created two different agents that play this game. And the agents are basically doing appraisal theory when they're generating their expressions, so we give them different goals. The cooperative agent has the goal of cooperating, so it should smile when we both cooperate together. If it happened to screw me over, it should feel bad about that and show guilt. Okay. On the other hand, a competitive agent that wants to win, if it screws me over, it should be happy about that. And if it misses the opportunity to screw me over, it should feel guilty. Okay. And so we created these two agents. They actually play exactly the same. They play tit for tat. So whatever you do on the next round, they'll play the same thing. The only difference is they show these different pattern and facial expressions. And then we had people play these agents. And so here's an example. Here's a woman participant who's playing a virtual character that's conveying a goal of wanting to cooperate. And the agent just plays tit for tat. So initially, she exploits the agent, and the agent shows anger. And then she tries to repair the relationship, tries to cooperate. Agent plays tit for tat, so it screws her over, but it shows sadness or guilt. And then they manage to both cooperate together, and from that point on, they both cooperate throughout the game. And we're able to show experimentally that even though the behavior of the agent is exactly the same, the only difference is the facial expressions, people cooperate much more with the agent that shows these cooperative emotional reactions to events. And through various techniques, we're able to show that what's really going on is that people see the expression. From that expression, they reconstruct how that other person is appraising the event and what their goal must be, and then use that inference to decide whether to cooperate or defect in the next round. Okay. Now that's people playing with this virtual person that's very stylized, but does this really happen between people? And so this is some work with Renz has been involved in. So we created a version of Prisoner's Dilemma. It's actually based on a British TV show called Golden Balls. So rather than blue or green, you get these little balls. You get to pick split or steal, and the other person picks split or steal. And you can see your opponents. It's basically you're playing this game via Skype with somebody else. And so this would be like what you would see. I could choose split or steal in this round. We play multiple rounds. And then this is me, and this is my opponent that I can see. And then I can see how this, you can't talk in this game. All you can see is their emotional reactions. And so you can see how do people react. So in this case, I try to cooperate, I get exploited, and I can see the other person's reaction to that. Okay? And what you're able to do in this game is kind of interesting is you can collect a lot of data on what people do. So this is a 10-round game, and we're running continuously facial expression analysis on people playing this game. And what you're able to do, see here are these the events in the game. So a new round, one person chooses, next person chooses, they reveal the joint outcome, next round, so forth. And then below here you're seeing each party's facial expression in response to that. So we can synchronize these people's facial reactions. We can synchronize it with their choices in the game, analyze that. We can also look at some maybe just personality influence things. And then we can try to see how do people's actual facial expressions influence outcomes in this game. And so this is the very simple game. 4 states you can be in this game. You can both cooperate, you can be exploited, you can exploit, you can both defect. And each of these arrows or transitions you can make through this space. And so we can look at, do facial expressions help us predict where people are going to go in this space? And in fact, we're able to do that. So we're able to show that people's facial expressions communicate what they're about to do. In general, if your opponent smiles, they're more likely to cooperate in the next round in this game. So what should you do with that information? See how they smile, what are you going to do? Well, the best way to make points in this game is to exploit the other party. And so, in fact, when you see your opponent smile, people are more likely to exploit them in the next round. But those people that do that, actually, they tend to, the team does worse. And so actually, the best people in this game are the ones that see their opponent smile, but they give up on the opportunity to screw them over, and they continue to cooperate, and those are the ones that make the most points. now I've told you appraisal theory kind of tells you what emotions you might expect to see in a person, what they might show. So they have, some event happens, they have a goal that will tend to influence what expression they will feel and most likely show on their face, although things like if they're with a friend or stranger might influence that. But generally, people will show their relationship, how an event relates to their goals. And now I've just shown you that when you see somebody showing an expression and you know the event they're reacting to, you can try to infer from that what their relationship or what their goal was. What's the relationship that to their goals. So now I'm going to say, how do we use that to influence people? And so this is some work I've been doing with some psychologists in Europe. But let me give you an example. And so I think you all know that you can use emotions to influence people, right? I don't know if you do it, but and so one context that I've been using to study that is negotiation. Because negotiation is actually a context where people are taught to use their emotions to manipulate other people. Business school is just next door. And so this is we brought people in the laboratory and we had them do negotiations where they could make money on how well they did. And let me just explain what's going on here. You're seeing a top-down view of two people interacting. So here you can see this guy's shirt here and this guy. And they have these blocks in front of them and they're told, they actually given a scenario. Okay, imagine you're going to Bakersfield and there's an abandoned storage locker there, and if you can agree on how to divide the items in this locker, you can make some money. Okay? And so these blocks represent the items in the storage locker, and they have 15 minutes to see if they can come to an agreement, and then they're rewarded based on how well they do in that interaction. So we play a little bit of that.
This can't be broke up. Okay, like I said before, if you get one, why you want one? Do you sell half a car? I won't accept it. I will only take the 3. And if I don't get the 3, then all I'm going to do is take the 1, and that's going to keep us at a stalemate and get nowhere. Okay? And then if you're going to...
So I'll just explain that if they fail to reach an agreement, each side only gets 1 item. Okay, so what this guy is doing is he's threatening. He's saying, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to walk away and we're going to both be screwed. So he's using threats. And if you watch the whole video, this guy's very aggressive and unpleasant. And he actually ends up getting the best deal of anybody in our study. Okay, so what is going on here? So the argument is that, okay, we talked about, we got appraisal theory, and we got what I call reverse appraisal theory, where you see the person's reaction and you try to infer their goals. But in fact, this person knows that you're reading his mind. Right? So when you're normally in an interaction and some event happens to you, you know that the other person is judging you and looking at your reaction shot to try to figure out what your mental state is. And so what if I want you to have a different belief about me than I really have? Well, then I should choose to show a different emotion than I really feel because I'm trying to influence your belief about me. So if I'm that criminal sitting there, even though I hated the person I just killed, but I'm trying to get off from the trial, I should show empathy, right? I should show that I care about and I'm sorry or whatever. Not because I feel it, but because I'm trying to influence the way you perceive my mental state. Okay. And people do this all the time, right? So when Stefan asked me what I think about his shoes, those are awesome shoes, man. I don't want to hurt his feelings. Or if I'm a car salesman, you know, I'm going to try to influence your emotional or your beliefs about me to sell you a more expensive car. Right? So, the question is here: how do people and perhaps machines know what emotions to strategically show? And again, this is not always just to win. If I'm an instructor and I see a student is having a really hard time and they're crushed, their confidence is destroyed, good instructors will use emotional signals and stuff to try to convey. They don't want to say, you're stupid, you're the dumbest student in my class. No, you try to build up a person's confidence. You say things you don't necessarily feel in the moment because you know you're having an effect and you're trying to influence that person's motivational state to do something good, to learn better, to exercise more. So there's a lot of pro-social reasons, not to hurt their feelings, pro-social reasons why we communicate something different than we feel. And of course, there's a lot of self-serving reasons why we communicate what we feel. So anyway, the question is, how does the machine determine, if it, depending on what its goal, it has a goal, it wants to make you work harder, or it wants to exploit you, what does it show to help achieve that goal? And then also on the flip side, how do people and possibly machines know when they're being played? So wouldn't it be nice if when you went to the car dealership you had a little thing on your shoulder that said, hey, this guy's playing you. Maybe you should walk away. And so, again, what I want to argue is appraisal theory helps you think this through. So let me give you an example, try to make it concrete. So imagine we're in a negotiation. And we're negotiating with this guy in how to divide up some apples. Okay. And we get $10 for each apple, and we don't like oranges. We actually get negative money if we take an orange. So what would you want to do? Like, you probably want all the apples and give them all the oranges, right? And so he doesn't care. He likes oranges and apples equally. And so in a kind of cards on the table negotiation, both players could say, well, I love apples, I hate oranges, I love everything. And if you pick up either through their emotions or through their words what their utility is, you can figure out how to divide this stuff up in a way that is equal and fair to everybody. Right? So this deal, she takes 2 of the apples, she gets $20. He takes 1 apple and all the oranges, he gets $20, and so everyone should be happy. On the other hand, imagine the situation unfolded like this. Rather than showing what she felt, she kind of leans back and says, well, what do you feel? What's good for you? He says, honestly, I like everything. And she says, I like everything too. How about this deal? Now this deal gives her everything she wants, and she ends up with $30. And he ends up with 15. She gets twice as much value as him by communicating falsely about what she wanted. And he feels, he's like clueless. He thinks, yeah, this is 50-50, it's a good deal. Because he thinks she got $15 too. She thought he assumed she's just like him. And of course, it really helps to show you're not really happy when you get a good deal. The worst thing you can do is say, yes! And then you should walk away. And then when you leave the door, then you can. So what's happening here is that when you do it in a negotiation, is you're trying to figure out what the other person wants. What makes them happy, what makes them unhappy, what maximizes their utility, and then compare that against what you want to find something that seems fair. So this is a representation of the joint utility space. This is the utility of a deal. Each of these circles is a possible deal. And this is utility, the pleasure that Bob gets for all these deals against the pleasure that the woman here gets for all these deals. Mary. And this, if we're honest, and everyone says honestly what they want, this black line, this is called something the Pareto frontier. These are all deals where there's no way to make the deal better for one person without hurting the other person. And so if you want to have an efficient negotiation where the joint value, the joint happiness is maximized, you should only consider these deals on this black line. But what Mary was doing is by showing different emotions, she's leading Bob to think there's a different Pareto frontier. She's trying to convey, we're on this space here, this is the deal that we just settled for. See, it's fair, it's 50-50, it's efficient, where in fact, she's getting a lot more stuff. So this is one way, by communicating different emotions about what you feel about different objects, you can create a false impression in the other party and influence the outcome. And so one way we've kind of tried to formalize this is something called the misrepresentation game. So these kind of joint decisions are often studied in an area called game theory. And so misrepresentation games are kind of game in the game theoretic sense of how do I lie, how do I convey a false set of emotions such that I maximize my own goals while making you feel good about it. Okay. And really there's two things you have to do. One is you have to figure out what the other person wants by studying their emotions or asking them questions, figure out what is the thing that gives them pleasure while avoiding revealing what you really want. And then once you know what they want, then you can calculate what beliefs they should have about you such that they feel like this is a good deal. And you can use some, formulate this as integer linear programming and do some good computer science stuff. So this is basically saying what we have to do is find a set of false utilities or pleasures to communicate to the other party such that my actual earnings are maximized while following certain social laws like we should be fair. So this is really combining optimization where we're encoding social norms like fairness into this kind of representation and finding how should I lie subject to the constraint that I appear to be honest and fair. This also, timely, this actually maps onto voting. So one of the things in voting theory about to have an election is people will often convey a false preference for a different candidate in order to do what's called strategic voting. So how do I manipulate votes in a way that helps my candidate win? But anyway, yeah, so you can formulate that as math. You don't care about it. You can show it's efficient. But in fact, it turns out really all you need to do to solve this game is to pretend to like the same thing the other person likes. So imagine we have this negotiation here where my opponent really likes apples, I really like pears. What I should do is say, it's obvious we both like the apples, but I'll give you what you want if you give me all the rest of this crap that I don't care about. Okay. So this is the basic solution. But what's interesting about the solution and the key to trying to tell that you're being played is that what's happening here is a person is saying they want one thing, but they're doing something different. They say they want apples, but they're taking all the other stuff. It turns out if you give this strategy to people, people actually fall for it all the time, and they think you're more honest if you lie in this way than if you're honest. And then we looked at whether people were doing that in this negotiation. So we went back and analyzed the behavior of people in this negotiation. It turns out that when they follow that strategy, they actually win in this game. And so a lot of the ways people are winning, they're pretending they like certain things. And Scherer, who's sitting in the back, she actually works with me, and she controls the agent, and she's learned how to use this strategy, and she can crush people. And they feel so good about it, right? They're like, oh, this is a great deal, thank you. It turns out this behavior is associated with certain personality traits. So people who engage in this kind of strategy are high in a trait called Machiavellianism, which is a personality trait where you're actually pretty good about reasoning about emotion, you just use it against people. But what we've been able to show in this data as well is that we can actually, with some accuracy, predict who's using that strategy. And the way we predict it is exactly as I said before. We look for people who say one thing and do a different thing. And that helps us tell that they're actually liars. And so really the way we do this is we look at their words, and you can actually pretty well figure out what somebody wants by just saying how many times, they tend to, the thing they want, they just talk about more. Okay, so we just have a very simple heuristic. We just count how many times they mention apples, bananas, and pears, and that helps us predict what they want. And then we can also just look at the offers they're making. So if you want apples, then you'll tend to keep the apples and give people other stuff. And so you can learn weights based on what people say and what people do. Normally those weights align very well, but when there's a difference between those weights, that predicts that person's alive. And I think we could do even better, not just looking at their words, but looking at their facial expressions or their voice. Anyhow, now what are we doing with this is we're putting these models into agents that can try to screw you over so that you can learn to not fall for that kind of stuff. So here's an example. It's a virtual human that you can practice negotiation skills with.
Well, hold on. I might be able to feed one of them, but I'd have to do 2 chairs in a plate. If I were to give up one of the chairs, I mean, what? How do you feel about that?
No, that's not going to work for me.
All right, so then what would work for you?
It's pretty obvious that we both want the chairs. How about if I take 2 chairs and we clock and you take 1 chair in both plates? I know you have buyers for these plates since they're in really good condition.
I mean,
How does that sound to you?
you said it yourself. These plates are in really good condition. So you could take, but, you could take both of the plates. I have much dinnerware as is.
One thing's kind of fascinating when you look at these negotiations is a lot of what the talk is about is people are really trying to shape your feelings towards the different items. So you may have noticed this character, she doesn't want these plates, and so she's saying, you should take these plates, they're really good, they have a good buyer. And so in some sense the agent is trying to change how you feel and saying, you should assign more value to this thing. And then he's not having anything to do with that. He's saying, no, as you said, they're really good plates. You should take them. You'll see people do these very elaborate strategies to try to influence people's emotional feelings about things. Like one example was a negotiation involving fruit. This one guy was saying, this apple has a worm in it. I can't give you this apple because I would feel bad that you would get sick eating this apple. So I should take it. In some sense it's a game, and they all know it's a game. But these are reflections of the things people really do in these strategies. So here I'm using emotion in a very limited sense, which is all the stuff I've been talking about up to now is really a particular view of emotion as information. Okay, so I've been saying all along up to this point that really when you see an emotional expression in another person's face, that emotion is giving you information about the goals that the other person has in a negotiation or whatever. So one thing you can do, and one reason to show anger in a negotiation is to say, I want to communicate to you that I have a high aspiration. I need to get a good deal, otherwise I'm going to be pissed off and walk away. And so one way of viewing that anger is you go, oh, that guy's angry, therefore I guess he has high aspirations, so I should give him more stuff. Okay, and so that's using emotion as information to make inferences. But so that's all the stuff I've been talking about right now. So when you see the sender showing expression, you try to infer what their goals are. But that's actually only half of the story. And it's the only half I'm going to talk about in detail in this talk, but it's only half the story because the other thing that emotion does is it makes you feel something, right? When you see somebody who's angry at you, you can think, oh yeah, they have high aspirations, they really want to win, so if only way to get a deal is to is to give them what they want, but at the same time, you think, that a-hole, I want to hurt them because they're so angry. And so that sometimes is an evocative path where, yes, you get the information, but the fact you're seeing this emotion changes your own emotion. And by changing your own emotion, changes the way you want to make decisions. And so if you see someone who's angry, that will often make you angry as well. And when you're angry, that changes the way you make decisions in all sorts of interesting ways. And so people who are angry, blood tends to flow to their arms. Why is that? Well, what Darwin would argue, and with some reason, is that you need to use your arms now because I'm angry. Okay? When you're angry, you're you're less concerned with risk. So you're more willing to do risky things. Now, from an evolutionary perspective, that seems useful because, if you're going to go attack, the last thing you want to do is worry about getting hurt yourself. You want to just go for it, right? When you're angry, you'll tend to see outgroups as these not human people who have no reason to be empathized with, which makes it easier to attack them, right? And so there's this whole host of changes that go on when you experience emotion. That's just anger. So different emotions will bias your decision making in other ways. And so what I've been talking about up to now is using these emotional signals, like, oh, I really like this apple, to influence your beliefs about me. But a lot of what we do when we're in social interactions is we try to influence that other person's emotions as well. So when I'm an instructor, I want to make the kid feel confident, but I also want to make them feel empathized with, understood. I want to put him in a more positive emotional state where he feels like he has more control of the situation. If I want to win a negotiation, I may want to try to induce fear in the other person. And so just to say, there's a lot of interesting ways that people and potentially machines can use emotion both as a communicative signal and as an evocative signal for good and ill. Right? And so it's sort of up to us to choose how we want to use that knowledge. Okay, so just to kind of wrap things up a little bit, first thing I try to talk about is that computer models can be used to understand and simulate emotions in a person. So we can figure out how, if an event occurs and we know that person has a goal, how they're most likely to respond to that. And then, of course, that could be a tool to help us figure out how to put someone in an emotional state. So we say, well, I know that if this action happens, given that they have this goal, they'll be afraid. So if I want to make them afraid, or I know that they will feel happier, use more positive example, if I have this event occur, and so if I want to make that student feel more happy or have a greater sense of control, I can choose actions that happen in the environment to manipulate their emotional state. That when you see these expressions on people, the second thing I talked about is that people do mind reading. They look at those expressions and they use something like appraisal theory to try to infer information about what those other person's goals might be based on the fact that they're showing this attitude towards an event that just occurred. And that finally, you can use these models in a strategic way to influence, or people do it as well, to influence the other party's belief about what they want in the moment based on strategic displays of emotional signals in order to influence those other people's beliefs. So let me just kind of end with, I want to go back to Ellie, because what I try, I know, positive note, all this stuff on manipulation. What I talked about at the beginning was that part of the reason that Ellie is an interesting tool is because she actually doesn't evoke an emotion in people. So normally, in a clinical setting, you are reluctant to reveal bad things about yourself or things you're ashamed about because you think the other person is judging you. And people want to be good people. They want to convey a good impression. They don't want to be negatively judged. And so they'll do what's called impression management, and they either won't reveal these negative things or they'll put them in a more positive light. And that can be great for keeping polite conversation going, but it's not so good if you're trying to give a medical diagnosis that this person has mental health issues. And so part of the potential of this technology is that it may not evoke fear. If the character emphasizes, hey, I'm a computer, I'm not judging you, people may actually feel less judged. And in fact, we have evidence to show that that's the case. And one of the pieces of evidence that we had is we followed a National Guard unit that went to Afghanistan. And so we had them interview this character, and then they went to Afghanistan, they came back, and they do what they normally do to try to get honest information about their mental state is they fill out a form, PHQ-8. It's a form, physician self-questionnaire, tries to get at if they have depression. So they fill out this form, and then they talk to the character. And this unit actually went through some pretty terrible things. So this is a woman here. She was in a convoy that was hit by an IED, explosive device, and the vehicle in front of her exploded. Her vehicle caught on fire and flipped over. And one of the questions that's diagnostic of depression is, do you have nightmares? Do you have bad dreams? And on the form, she said no. And that form is what goes to the military to decide if she needs to seek treatment. And then she talked to this character. And let me just play a little bit of that. You have to read because the audio is really bad.
What times when thoughts or memories just keep going through your head when you wish they wouldn't?
Sure. Wake up thinking I'm dying. Yes. Thinking I'm on fire. Sure. Thinking I didn't get out of my vehicle. Yep. Thinking that I left a guy stuck in a vehicle. Yep. Oh, I can't do this. What? Feeling stuck on the X. Yep. Thinking that, more fuckers were going to come out of the crowd, or I've had every fucking dream there is to have, so, but they're just dreams, so, I'm thankful for that, because it didn't happen, right? Got blown up, got out the vehicle, was fine, was safe, nobody died, nobody lost a limb, nobody was gravely injured. I'm here to tell the story, so I'm thankful for that. So, those are all the positives. So dreams are just dreams. Wake up and, you push that shit out of your head. You go on with your life.
How much of a problem has this been for you?
It's not a problem. Just life.
Can you tell me?
So most physicians that look at that say that's a problem. She says it's not a problem. She didn't report that in her questionnaire. But I think there's good reason to believe that she's got issues with that. Anyway, so just to emphasize, that's emotion, right? And this is technology trying to get at emotion. And so I think there's a lot of interesting opportunities to combine psychology and computer science to understand people, to help them do better things in their lives, to create a lot of interesting, innovative applications. I'll leave you with that. Some time for questions.
So I have this question about like domain. like, do you think like the game you discussed was like taking apples and then oranges? Like, do you think like the outcome of the emotions will change? Let's say, had it been exchange of weapons or something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things so I work a little bit with a psychologist here, Mathieu Chollet, who studies moral decision making. And so we have a version of that scenario where it's not apples, it's that you, well, again, it's a scenario, but imagine you're Afghani in a village and there's an earthquake and your kid needs medicine or they're going to die. And you have to negotiate with somebody over medicine and food and water. And what we find is framing it that way changes the nature of the way people reason about that negotiation. In general, emotion, one of the things that strong emotions often evoke very different ways of framing decisions, that we tend to see them much more black and white. We apply these moral norms when it's a very emotional thing. And actually, when you're teaching negotiation in the business school, they talk about the difference between interests and rights. And interests are basically how much money you're going to make, right? Or how much happiness you'll drive from it. And rights are, social justice, what are the rules, fairness. And what people often, when they get emotional, is they get fixated on rights to the detriment of interests. And a lot of what you try to do in a negotiation is to try to set rights aside so that people can focus more on interests. And you can even do things, so there's evidence that, and I don't know if you know this term, shuttle diplomacy. A lot of times when you have conflict, particularly amongst males, it's better to separate, not to let them look at each other in the eye. Because you'll get these what are called escalatory spirals, where they get angrier and angrier and angrier. And people will actually come up with better deals if you put a barrier so they can't look at each other in the eye when there's a conflict situation. So it's trying to get the emotion off the table. Yeah. We've been toyed like, what if we make this like USC versus UCLA? And part of the reason we use these objects, so there's all this, so in psychology, there's this area of psychology called behavioral economics. And it emphasizes that, so economics is usually about how people make decisions involving money, and they use economic models, which are usually rational decision theory models like game theory and decision theory. And the problem is that people don't follow those models. And so behavioral economics is trying to say, well, what do we need to add to those models to actually predict what people really do? And a lot of that is involving emotion. And a lot of it is really subtle things. So one thing that they study in behavioral economics is, what I've done is I've physically instantiated these objects, okay? And I've allowed you to move them around. And so there's something called the endowment effect studied in behavioral economics. And the fact that this thing is on my side of the table, I kind of own it now. It has more value to me because it's on my side. And so there's a lot of these little subtle things. People get annoyed when you reach over into my space and you take my thing. Suddenly that thing is more powerful because you're taking it away from me. And so this is an interesting, not just to study emotion, but these kind of subtle things like, it shouldn't matter that this is a piece of medicine versus a chair, but it does. It shouldn't matter that it's on my side or your side, but it does. People get hung up. They make a lot of money. The best deal for people often is that they take two things and give the other person four things. They don't want to do that because they want to have 3 and 3. Somehow these 3 sounds fair, even though they're losing money. So people bring all kinds of interesting side issues into these decisions, and part of what affective computing, behavioral economics is trying to do is how do we come up with better models of these quote-unquote irrelevant factors that actually dictate how people make decisions.
Just a small follow-up, I'm sorry. So, do you think if I learn something from one domain and then if I try to classify problems of other it feels like it's just that we see different intensity of emotions in different domains, or is it like we see new features or new emotions?
Yeah, so I mean, I think the trick in making something domain independent is to understand what part of what seems to be superficial really is fundamental and what really is superficial. And so one thing so it seems irrelevant whether these are plates or chairs or clocks or whatever. It seems very relevant if these things have symbolic value like UCLA, USC, or a Christian, Muslim, or what. So there's certain attributes of things that behave differently. They behave in a more sacred way versus a more secular way. And so we have to understand those kinds of distinctions, but then hopefully there's this class like sacred value that if we know, okay, it's a sacred value versus a secular value, then we can abstract at that level. So a lot of the trick is trying to figure out what characteristics of the domain do we have to attend to and which are kind of can be ignored. And what a lot of behavioral economics, and we're still trying to parse it out, is that there's some things that people have assumed are irrelevant that in fact very important. And we need to include those into our domain independent model. But hopefully, once we have a good model of that, now we can apply that in very different domains.
My question goes from Descartes' error. So how do you feel about adaptive unconscious and our own inability to understand how we feel? Because it seems that tracking it through multisense would be incredibly useful because we don't have access to that part of us. And a lot of biases are coming from exactly there.
Yeah, so one of the things, let's see if I can, I'll just leave this, I didn't talk about this too much, but what you're alluding to is that, so when people make decisions, I kind of gave a simplified model that when people make decisions, the way I describe it is they appraise it, that leads to an emotional state, and that emotional state influences the decision making. Now, in fact, what can happen is that, and this is what you would call an endogenous emotion. The emotion is arising from the decision that I'm doing. Okay? But a lot of times, emotions come in from somewhere else entirely. So it's a nice day outside. So we're probably all happy. We're in Iceland in the middle of winter, where there's no sun. You know, we might feel a little different. Or if we watch a debate, depending on what side we are, I might be really angry today. And we're not always aware that we're in that emotional state. And when we make decisions, actually, and what Damasio argues, and there's good evidence for, is there's a level of indirection that these things influence our emotion, but other things influence our emotion, but it's our emotion in the moment that influences our decision. So people will make a different decision on a cloudy day than a sunny day. Okay? Although, interestingly, if you make them aware of that bias, so if you say, hey, what's the weather like outside? Now, what decision you want to make? Then the effect of that exogenous emotion goes away. So when people become aware of their emotional state, they're able to better discount the impact of that emotional state in making decisions. And so you might imagine something like multisense. I mean, the way that we try to deal with it from the psychological side is to teach people mindfulness or be more aware of their body and understand their emotions and how their emotions might influence you moment to moment, and then you should be able to make better decisions. And you might imagine that, you know, multisense could say, hey, you know, you look a little angry. You know, are you really angry? Do you want to think about that anger before you hold the vote in the election? So yeah, I think technology has the potential to make us more aware of our emotional state and how those emotions influence decision making. Anything else?
Thank you.